NIL Now with Lauren Sisler and Kevin Jones.
If you want to learn more about name, image, and likeness, you need to go to The Source. The NIL Now podcast from Headline Studio and Reddit highlights the biggest storylines with comments from key guests in the college and high school NIL space.
NIL is not a cherry on top. It needs to be thought about as a part of these young men and women's future to, further their careers. You should be able to leave college with something.
Subscribe to NIL Now on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
The offseason continues. The draft is getting closer, and we are already almost in the middle of the week. Just 2 more weeks to go until the NFL draft, and we're going to keep bringing you all the good hits before then as we continue previewing all of the Bengals' positional needs and much more intriguing storylines surrounding Joe Burrow and other factors involving this year's draft. Welcome into another pre-draft edition of the Strictly Stripes podcast. Muhammad Ahmad, Andrew Gillis, and Mike Nizick here with you on this Tuesday as we look at what the Bengals need up front in the trenches on defense. We've talked about the trenches on offense, tight end, running back, cornerback. We even mentioned safety on Monday. If you missed that conversation, tune into that as we talked about that and Odell Beckham signing with the Ravens, what that means for the Bengals. And guys, we have obviously, on this podcast talked about, the Bengals needing a little more juice in the pass rush. Duke Tobin's acknowledged it. We've acknowledged it. I think a lot of people would definitely acknowledge that as well. And I think, it is going to be an area, specifically at least the interior line, that I think they're going to look at in this year's draft. But here's an interesting trend to kind of look at before I get your all's thoughts on, what the Bengals should do and who they should get. I did some digging, and the Bengals haven't selected a D lineman in the first round since 2001, and they selected Justin Smith in that draft, who had a decent career in Cincinnati, didn't really get recognized until he went to the 49ers and played in the Super Bowl there. But, since then, you look at the last decade, they've only picked 3 guys in the second round. This is in the 2010s decade. Carlos Dunlap was the only one that made a Pro Bowl. You can also say they picked Geno Atkins in the 4th round, but how often do you get a 4th rounder who's an all-pro Pro Bowler? If you look at the trend they've been doing the last couple of years, they've been getting guys in that mid-tier 3rd through 5th round, like Joseph Osai, 3rd round. They get Cam Sample in the 4th round in 2021, Khalid Kareem 5th round in 2020, and then you get Zach Card in the 3rd round last year. So I don't know if it's luck. I don't know if it's just an intentional plan, but do you guys think the Bengals might kind of buck history and change course and say, okay, maybe we really need that much more juice in the pass rush. We need to prioritize this early. Do you think at that point, if the right guy is there, they take somebody in the first round, that defensive line?
I think you have to. I've kind of been beating the drum here for the last couple of weeks on taking whoever's the highest player on your board, but obviously you're not going to take a quarterback or whatever at 28. But, I think when you look at the defensive line, you've got to get more out of the defensive line. And, in our latest mock draft, we'll get to the names here in a few minutes. But in my latest mock draft, I had, the Bengals going defensive line in the first round. I just think, this is a position where you've upgraded your secondary. In terms of cornerbacks, you would think from last season with Cam Taylor-Britt and Cheeto coming back, you feel good there, but your safeties you're still kind of concerned about, and it's a game about defending the pass, and the way to do that is to get after the quarterback. So yeah, I think you kind of have to if you like some defensive linemen that are on the board there at the end of the first round, especially when you look at some of the contracts that are kind of coming up here in the next couple of years.
Yeah,
well, I think it depends. I think this draft. I had Miles Murphy going. Then the last mock draft I did. I'm not sure how realistic that is now after he was able to work out at his own pro day. He didn't work out at Clemson's. He had a special workout, and most of the NFL attended, and he just knocked it out of the park. And his numbers are ridiculous for his size. But there's only 4 or 5 guys in terms of defensive ends that really. I don't know, in this draft at the top end would be good picks, and they might all be gone, by the time they take at number 28. I think if one of them falls to them, I think they should absolutely act on that. But I think it might be tough with where they're at to find one of those sort of premier guys that can make a difference right away.
Yeah, if you don't have like a Brian Breesy or, Miles Murphy, or maybe even like if you're looking on the interior, Maisie Smith from Michigan, who I think that's who you had, Andrew, in your mock draft, right? Is that who you picked in the first round?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great pick. I think, if you have either of those three guys, I think you should, especially if you don't think you can get a Darnell Wright, or one of those better offensive tackles. Like, even if I think, say, DeJuan Jones is there, I think you can skimp on him if, in this case, any of those names I mentioned are there. If not, I don't think it's worth stretching. Maybe getting somebody who's a mid-second round guy, early second round guy. I think at that point you just got to get the best player available. If it's DeJuan Jones, if it's any other offensive tackle like DeJuan Jones, if it's even a cornerback. We talked a lot about that kind of late last week where the Bengals could make a move for that. Like if certain guys like Deonte Banks are available. Maybe if Bijan Robinson's available, I mean, the Bengals will follow course and pick a high running back like they did with Joe Mixon a few years ago and other previous drafts. But yeah, I really think, the more you guys have talked about it on this podcast, like, I'm not oblivious to the fact that the Bengals need more juice in the pass rush, but I just wonder, though, like, if you pick a guy in the first round that's on the D line, like, how much are you missing out on maybe, like, one of the better running backs? Like, I mean, what if somehow, like, do you envision a weird scenario where, like, you have a Bijan Robinson and one of those three guys available, or do you think that's really unrealistic to even think about?
I mean, I haven't seen. I mean, Robinson's getting all sort of, keeps going higher up. I mean, teams are talking about, him. How should the Bears take him at number 9 and things like that? So I mean, I think that's sort of. I mean, I'd be surprised if he was there. No, I don't see a scenario where he's available.
Yeah, I don't either. But I was just wondering because I guess what I'm getting at is like, without knocking on any of those D linemen we mentioned, I just wonder though, like if you take one of those guys, are you missing out on like an even better impact player? And I mean, we can't really say for sure because we don't know who's going to be on the board until the board actually shows up. But I do definitely think though that like if it's your best player available, if it's any of those guys, absolutely, like Andrew says, run to them. But you kind of weigh that against, like I mentioned, Sam Hubbard's a 3rd-round pick, Joseph Ossai is a 3rd-round pick, Zach Carr's a 3rd-round pick, and I mentioned some of the other names who were drafted a little bit later. In terms of D linemen that the Bengals have drafted in the last half decade. I mean, do you guys think that they're starting to see this and think, okay, other than maybe Sam Hubbard and Joseph Ossai if he was healthy, these guys aren't really working out because Sample hasn't really stepped up. Khalid Kareem's not even on the Bengals anymore, and he was a practice squad wave. I mean, do you think maybe they're going to look and say, I think we probably really need to draft a little bit higher with, the defensive line?
I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily the way they're looking at it. I think you like what you have in DJ Reader, obviously. They've kind of raved about Sam Hubbard and Trey Hendrickson kind of being complete packages, both, in kind of knowing where to be, knowing where to line up, stopping the run. Their win rates throughout the year, some advanced numbers like that, kind of looked at them a little favorably. I think that you need to invest highly in defensive line because it's one of those premier positions. But I'm not sure if you necessarily overhaul your draft process because of one position group or anything like that.
Gotcha.
But Andrew, I think, brought up a good point with the contracts. I mean, if you're not you can't really spend now at defensive end, so you're not going to sign an impact defensive end in free agency. I mean, it seems like a long shot that you re-sign Hendrickson, especially at his age, when his contract's up. I mean, so how do you find an impact defensive end? How do you find an impact pass rusher? And that has to be the draft at that point. You can't go bargain at every position. And I think defensive end in particular, you need a guy with a high ceiling, a high upside. And I don't think outside of, the veterans they have, I don't think any of those young guys have shown that they're, really consistent impact players getting to the quarterback. That could be functional depth guys. Zach Carter and still has a ways to go, but I think you do need an impact player, and if you can't find them in free agency at some point, you are going to have to change your draft strategy, because you can't just, not find players at one of the, most important positions on the field. And you've used a lot of your draft capital on positions that you're set. Wide receiver, you're not going to draft another guy in the first round or first 3 rounds right now, or quarterback, obviously. And so I do think that there is something to be said for you guys got to kind of move to get a pass rusher, because the way the cap structure, you're probably not going to be able to afford one of those top tier guys.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, like you mentioned Trey Hendrickson like earlier. I mean, he's going into the second to last year of his contract. I mean, he's a pretty big cap casualty in 2024. So it's like, if you're not happy with him next year, do you save the money and move on from him, in 2024, assuming, like Mike said, you've got a guy that you pick up, in this year's draft? Because, I mean, beyond that, I mean, they got Terrell Basham, which was a bargain hunting pickup for depth. That's pretty much it. I mean, you got all the other names I mentioned, like Osai Sample, Jeff Gunter, who seems like he might be more of a practice squad kind of guy unless he makes the 53-man again, play special teams. You need bodies there. But I'm just curious, like, on the defensive line, what do you think they prioritize? Do you think they prioritize an interior guy, or do you think they prioritize an edge rusher, in the draft?
I mean, I don't personally think
I think with an edge rusher, if somebody falls to them, that could be an impact player. I think they should look at that. I think if somebody doesn't sort of fit that mold, I could see them drafting kind of a defensive tackle, defensive end guy in the top 3 rounds. But I don't know if it jumps ahead of the priorities at running back and tight end. I think they should try to find that impact guy. But if they're not going to trade up, or if all those top, say the top 5 are gone, you probably go in a different direction in sort of like the first 2 days of the draft.
You were saying something, Andrew? Yeah, I don't think it really matters, defensive end or defensive tackle. Just kind of when you look at the group. I mean, you mentioned the Terrell Basham signing. You bring him in, but that's a depth piece right there. That's not something that is really going to move the needle a whole heck of a lot. So. I mean, you look at, Brian Brzee, is he a guy who can play a 3-tech? Because, again, you like Reeder, but, I believe Reeder's going into a contract year, and that's not exactly the most stable. So, I mean, do you draft kind of his replacement a year in advance? That would kind of fit like a Mozzie Smith, the defensive lineman out of Michigan. Do you go there? Do you go Brzee? Do you go for the guy who's undersized in Kalijah Kancey? Like, out of Pitt, like there's different guys and different kind of molds that you can do here. So I don't think it really matters, DN, D tackle, whatever. I personally, I just think you need upgrades on your defensive line, players that can push the pocket and kind of help out the secondary a little bit.
I agree with all that, but I think if you're somehow in a position where, like, and this is, again, if you're in this position where you can pick between a really good edge rusher and a really good D tackle, I think you'd probably want to lean D tackle because, like you just said, DJ Reader is in a contract year going into next season. And I don't think the Bengals – I could be wrong, but, I mean, that's a guy who's going to be closer to the age of 30 after next season. He struggled with injuries a little bit last year, so maybe that catches up to him down the road. Who knows? If he can stay healthy and he has a monster year, then maybe we have a conversation about why the Bengals re-sign him to a midterm deal, but – I just have the sense that it's kind of like Von Bell. Maybe, like I said, Von Bell's going to be 30 soon. Same thing with DJ Reader. Bell left. Maybe Reader does the same. The Bengals just aren't really a team that keeps guys that are into their early 30s, especially at least on the defensive side of the ball. And like the same thing with Hendrickson. Like even if they keep him throughout the 2 years, like if they don't cut him, I mean, that's just going to be at a point where it's like, okay, I don't think we're going to bring you back. Like, because at that point, he'll definitely be 30 well at the end of his deal. So I think if you're just playing in terms of immediacy, you want to get a guy at 3-tech, because it's not just Reader being in a contract year. Like we've talked about BJ Hill. I mean, he's a little bit younger, which is good, and they've got more time out of him on his deal, but you can't let him play as many snaps as he played. I get DJ Reader was hurt last year, but they got to give the guy a break because eventually like that fatigue and, that age is going to catch up. So I think if you can pick, I'd lean D tackle, but otherwise, like Mike said, if the best guy is there at D end, get him at D end and deal with D tackle later in the draft. There's a lot of names that I think we can look at in terms of who would fit the Bengals, later in the draft. And when we come back, we're going to talk about those names, talk about what kind of prototypes and people that the Bengals have looked at traditionally on the defensive line and who they might look at in this year's draft. All that and much more to come right here on the Strictly Stripes podcast. And thanks for staying with us on the Strictly Stripes podcast as we continue talking about what the Bengals should do with the D-line in this year's draft and how they should approach selecting a D-lineman. We talked a lot about, do they kind of change the course and prioritize an edge rusher or an interior guy really early? But, as much as we mentioned like the big names like the Brian Breezy and Miles Murphy, Maisie Smith, there's a lot more I think we could talk about. And so kind of like we've done with the other positions like cornerback, safety, and, tight end, I asked you guys earlier, like, who would you guys want to pick and when would you want to pick them? So I know you talked a little bit about those first round guys, but do you still feel like you're set on the Bengals need to get an edge rusher in the first round, or is there somebody second through whatever mid rounds that the Bengals could get a steal out of, and why do you make that justification? Who wants to go first?
Andrew.
Take a bow, Andrew.
So I'll go first. Like I said, I don't think you necessarily need, edge rusher round one. I don't think you necessarily need, D tackle round one. I do think you need some kind of significant investment. I mean, hell, when I was looking at my mock draft, there were guys there, I picked Mozzie Smith at 28, and you're sitting there at 60 and, okay, well, do I pull the trigger on, a guy like Isaiah Foskey? He was Notre Dame's all-time leading sack getter. Like, is that a guy that you want to add to this defense? Like, there are guys that you can add. I mean, obviously the upside of kind of drafting some of these guys is not going to be as high. So I don't know. I think there are guys, but the thing that I would worry about if I were the Bengals is just kind of getting, a handful of sacks, 3-4 sacks in a rookie year, because, what is that really getting you? If you want a guy who, you're talking about Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard, guys who can get you eight plus sacks. Like, that's good when you have both of those numbers coming off the edge on either side, but you kind of look at the depth behind them and they just didn't get anything from the rest of the pass rushers. So, to me, I think, you need some kind of impact. So, I would kind of caution against waiting too long. There are guys there. I think they're going to be more valuable depth pieces than anything. You would have to kind of draft a project like, an Andre Carter from Army that, maybe can develop into something in a year if you really want to see, like a truly high kind of round one upside, I would think.
Yeah, defensive end, I'm kind of all in on Miles Murphy. I think he's going to be like the standout, other than maybe Will Anderson, behind him, who I think is kind of, I think, by the way, considered, maybe even the best draft prospect in the entire draft. But I think Murphy's pretty impressive. For defensive interior, I think this kid out of Baylor, I terrible pronunciation, but was it Saki Akia?
Siaki Ikea, yeah.
Yeah. So
from Baylor.
Size alone makes him kind of an intriguing prospect. 6'4", 350 plus pounds. Even if he's not good, he's going to eat up space, right? Like, I mean, if he can't, if he's not, if he's still learning the game, he's a guy that could just be disruptive by the sheer size of him in the middle, and should be able to stop the run, but also shown real knack at getting the passer. He's kind of an intriguing guy, a day 2 pick. Might be an interesting prospect, but I think if you're going to draft a defensive end, you go big or you don't, because like I said, I agree with Andrew where you want a guy that's going to make an impact, and I think there's very few of those guys that probably are on the board, and even fewer that might fall to the Bengals. So that'd be tough, but that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned Siaki Ikea from Baylor, because I mean, he had 33 pressures, in 2021, which was, I believe, his junior year. dipped off a little bit last year, which is why maybe he's not as high as he could be. But I mean, 358 pounder who can make centers and guard miss. Like, I mean, that is just, that's crazy. I mean, that lower body strength is what lets him win so many of those battles. And so I think if you want to go like second, third round, you could look at him. Another guy that's similar to him is Keanu Benton from Wisconsin. Again, these are both at, defensive tackle. I think if you want to go that route, like second, third round, a guy that I think, maybe not play right away, but, can develop into that role. I think those are guys you could go for. As far as edge rushers, though, I think when you look at the trends of like who the Bengals have picked, like all those names I mentioned from like the last, 5 years, they get guys that are anywhere from 6'3" to 6'5", nothing shorter, nothing taller. And it's just always in that like 265, 275 range. So maybe not big like Myles Garrett big, but you don't want someone a little bit lighter than that where maybe they're more of like a hybrid outside linebacker. So I think if the trends go that way where the Bengals pick someone in that size range, then I'm looking at names who fit that exact bill, like Lucas Van Ness, who, I mean, I don't know, his stock's been like really high since the combine. I actually wrote about him not long ago, Yaya Diaby from Louisville, a fourth-round guy who had a good combine to kind of keep him in that mid-tier range where he didn't drop off anywhere lower than that. Zach Harrison from Ohio State intrigues me. Doesn't have the agility you would expect, which is why I think he's like kind of a fourth-round guy, but maybe get to the fourth round and he's there. Isaiah Foskey from Notre Dame, that's another name that, again, is similar to all those other names in terms of talent, and he's in that, prototype of, being like a 6'4", 270 edge rusher. So I don't think you can go wrong with either of those guys. When I did my mock draft, blanking out here, it was last weekend, I had Kobe Turner, a name that's an interesting one. Kobe Turner from Wake Forest, had him in the fourth round, and he's interesting because his PFF grades are great, but he did not get invited to the combine. Can't say for sure why. If I had to guess, it's because outside of his talent, like even though he's good, I think his measurements probably didn't fit the bill because he's on the smaller side. He's about 6'2", 280, and I think his arms were like 31, like his wingspan is like 31, 32 inches, which I don't think matters if you have the athleticism to make up for it, which his stats and grades seem to indicate. So maybe he's got that chip on his shoulder and, he gets picked up mid-round, third, fourth, fifth round, and he proves himself. So he's an interesting guy. PFF graded it as an A-plus pick, so I guess maybe I did something right there. Maybe the Bengals would too if they did, but I don't think you could go wrong with any of those guys, especially him. I think you always like a good underdog kind of pick, and I always enjoy seeing that. But I guess kind of to tie this up here, we talked about, again, this is before free agency. We talked about linebacker. Do the Bengals pursue a linebacker in the draft? Obviously, it changed because Jermaine Pratt is back. So at this point, it's really not even a need, like way less of a need than safety, which I think we kind of debated. You don't even need to pick either in the draft. You can get in free agency. But, I mean, you think about it, like let's assume the Bengals, don't extend Logan Wilson, and he's a free agent next year. Akeem Davis-Gaither, Marcus Bailey are free agents next year. Do you at least, even if it's like a 6th, 7th round pick, like kind of like they did with Marcus Bailey, 7th round pick in 2020, do you get a guy like that this year where it's like, okay, we don't know if we can keep all three of those guys. Let's try to plan for some depth now. Or do you just kind of wait and see how things play out, see if you keep Logan Wilson, and if not, then worry about drafting a linebacker next year?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they could do one late in the draft. I mean, there's no sort of, at that point, you're just kind of trying to find guys you like and guys on your board. I don't think it would be crazy to see them, take a flyer on somebody, but in the first 4 or 5 rounds, I think that wouldn't be the best use of your draft capital.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you look at this year, you got Jermaine Pratt, Logan Wilson, Akeem Davis-Gaither's backup. You got Joe Bacci, Marcus Bailey is some special teams guys. Like, to me, that's fine for this year. So I could definitely see kind of a depth player come in because, Logan Wilson entering a contract year, Akeem Davis-Gaither entering a contract year, Joe Bacci, Marcus Bailey, both on 1-year deals. Like, it's not hard to see kind of a revamping of the Bengals linebacker position headed into the 2024 season. So yeah, I think, a depth player, someone that, maybe you can bring up slow and, kind of say, hey, your 2023 is not your year, but, we'll see where we're at a year from now. I think that's not the worst strategy in the world, but again, it depends. And if the Bengals go into this season or this upcoming season with kind of the linebackers that I mentioned, I think you're feeling okay about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think even kind of like Mike was saying with the safety position, maybe you get in a guy who's an undrafted free agent and you try him out. And if you think that's a guy to keep on the practice squad and, maybe cultivate for a year and then see what happens in, the 2024 offseason, yeah, maybe you could. That's what they did with Vinny Ray. I mean, he was an undrafted free agent in 2010, played special teams like Joe Bocci, and then, a couple years down the road became like a starter and a team captain. So, I mean, it's not common, but it's not impossible. I mean, kind of like we said, how the Bengals have so many undrafted guys in their secondary. Historically, they've had that in their linebacker room. So, I could see that. But again, I think the only case where you should even consider that is like if it's 6th, maybe 7th round, and at that point you feel really good about who you have, and then it's like, okay, the best guy we can pick is a linebacker, and it's not going to be Ivan Pace. Like, that guy's going to be way off the board, and that's not a need the Bengals need to worry about right now. If they didn't bring back Jermaine Pratt, I would actually say, okay, maybe you should entertain the idea of an Ivan Pace, but that's just not the case. Hey, that kind of rhyme. That's funny. But, yeah, I don't know. I think it was just a thought I had because it makes you wonder, like, kind of tying it back to defensive end. Like, what if they get a guy who, plays outside linebacker, so he can kind of play like a Jermaine Pratt in coverage, but then you need him to get to the pass, to rush the pass. Like, you could do that. That's kind of why I was thinking of that. But I think at that point, I'd have to look at the board again for guys that late, but I don't think there's anybody that late where the Bengals could get someone with a description I just had. So I think really you just kind of wait and see. And then if you really have to worry about it, then you worry about it next year. Like, if you don't keep Logan Wilson, that's what the draft is there for next year. And, like Mike said, and this is kind of important to preface, like we've talked about, once these guys, these veterans like Hendrickson, among others, DJ Reader, let's say these guys keep going. I mean, at that point, you're going to have to replace them with the draft. Maybe some depth pieces in free agency, but it's going to be a different trend from what we've seen the last 2 years with, the big money spending and the splashes. So something that I think we definitely need to get used to for the years and times to come. But stay with us because later this week, we're going to talk about the one draft need that we haven't even talked about that I think no one is talking about. What is that? You have to tune in tomorrow to find out. Later this week, we're going to talk about Joe Burrow and what free agency means to him this offseason and how that sets him up for 2023. But once again, for myself, Andrew, and Mike, I'm Muhammad Ahmad. We will see you on Wednesday.